First thing that I'm going to show you guys is just the basics of this digital SLR camera. The lens, the SLR camera allows you to remove your lenses and interchange them and use what lenses you need. The lens that we have on here is a 24 to 105 millimeter. That refers to its zoom, or really how wide of a field that I am taking a picture of. So at 24 millimeters, I have a very wide zoom. I could probably take, I probably have about this kind of angle, my lens, and as I zoom in, my angle becomes less and less. So when I get to 105 millimeters, my angle is just about right here. So this inner ring is essentially your zoom ring, so you twist it to zoom in and out. This outer ring is the focus ring, but we'll be shooting automatic focus, so you don't need to worry about it. To shoot with this digital SLR, just to cover right quick, the button is right here. Incidentally, whenever you guys are using this camera, make sure that this is around your neck. We'll be shooting like that. We'll also be shooting tethered, so there's going to be a cord coming out of here to the computer. As soon as you shoot the photo, it's going to go right to the computer and show up. So in order to shoot the photo, when I press the button down halfway, that will force the camera to focus, and then when I press it down all the way, it takes the photo. Now, onto the more technical stuff of the camera. Now, most of you won't have to worry about this, as it will be shooting in time priority. There are three things that determine whether or not you get a good exposure in your camera. This is just the technical aspects of your camera. And this happens in every camera in some form or fashion or another. The three things are time, aperture, and ISO. In film, ISO was known as ASA. The first, and whenever each of these three things, you're balancing something. You've got other concerns. You've got two concerns, and you're trying to find wherever your happy medium is with that. And typically, with photography, we want to capture as much light as possible. It's usually what we're trying to achieve. So we usually don't have enough light. So the first thing is time. So whenever I take a photo, so when everybody hears that, two things are happening. One, I have like a reverse periscope in here that allows me to look through the lens. And so there's what SLR refers to is the mirror or reflector, which is the R part of SLR. It bumps up. So there's a mirror in here that lets me look through the lens as I shoot, through this port right here. And it pops up. And then the next thing is that there are two curtains that come down. And then behind those curtains is the CCD, or a charged coupled device. Or if we were shooting film, it would be film. So these two curtains come down like this. So that mirror comes up, and then the two curtains come down. And the distance between those two curtains is the amount of exposure that we have. So if my window is very, very narrow and those curtains come down, then my exposure is very, very short. If it's very, very long, I could have it come down like this. I'd have maybe a second of exposure. The thing that we're balancing when we decide on how much time we want to shoot, today we'll be shooting at 1/100th of a second, is whether or not our subject, and also the person holding the camera, is going to move. So if I'm shooting sports photography, particularly at a long distance, then I need to shoot at maybe 1/2000th of a second, or 1/4000th of a second, to get that action in there without it blurring in some form or fashion. Now, if somebody's hand-holding a camera and we're doing portraiture, you could probably go down to 1/60th of a second pretty easily. And you can probably, if you're really steady, you can go down to 1/30th of a second. So the next thing, dealing with our exposure, is our aperture. Aperture, because the camera is built a little bit like our eyes, aperture is essentially your iris. It's just a circle that's inside the lens. And it opens and closes based on a value that we give it, which is the f-stop. So today we'll probably get, let's see what kind of f-stop I get out of here. Because I'm shooting time priority, I'm telling the camera that I want it to pick my f-stop value. So right now in this room, I'm shooting at 100th of a second at an f-stop of 4.0. That's relatively fairly open. Because there's not a lot of light for this camera to capture in here. Even though it's pretty bright to our eyes, there's still not quite enough light for this thing to really bring down the f-stop. Now, the thing that we're balancing with our f-stop is our depth of field. So, as I make that aperture more and more open, I get a shorter and shorter depth of field. And what depth of field is if you imagine a straight line coming out of this camera. I'll set that here. You imagine a straight line coming out of that camera, there's going to be an area in which the image is going to be in focus and an area which is not. So that refers to a box coming out from the camera. So as I increase my aperture value, as I drop that f-stop lower and lower, let's say if I dropped it down to 2.8, I'm going to make my depth of field relatively shallow. Some lenses go down to 1.8, 1.2. That's pretty, very, very thin strip depth of field at 1.2. And sometimes you want that. Sometimes you want that very, very shallow depth of field. You want that creativity. Sometimes you don't. If I'm shooting, let's see, if I'm shooting jewelry, one of the things that also affects depth of field is my distance from my subject. So if I get really, really close, then I'm also going to narrow my depth of field. Incidentally, if I get really, really far away, I'm also going to narrow my depth of field. So as far as you get away from that normal view, you decrease your depth of field. So when I was shooting this jewelry, I wanted it entirely in focus. And even though I was very up close to it, I could not shoot at f2.8. It was just too blurry. Much of the jewelry was not in focus. I had to drop my f-stop down to like f22, f24. When I shoot landscapes, I don't really need to capture as much light. I've got the sun on my side, and I'm also tend to use a tripod. So I can take a longer exposure, maybe an entire second. If I'm doing night photography, I'm going to shoot probably about 20 seconds, maybe 10 seconds, on a tripod. And I can get my f-stop down to maybe f11, f13 is what landscape portraiture is usually at, landscape photography is at. The third thing that determines whether or not we get a good exposure is your ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of the CCD within the camera. So ISO values refer a number like 100, 200, 300, 400, on and up. So at ISO 100, I'm shooting at 100% sensitivity. At ISO 200, I'm shooting at 200% sensitivity, and so on and so forth. And this camera goes up to, let's see, 6400, I believe. Yeah, 6400%.